There are nights when history holds its breath, nights when the future casts shadows that reach backward through time, when what has not yet happened feels already written in the stones and stars. On such a night in June of the year 68, a man knelt alone in a cramped room beneath a freedman's villa, 4 miles from the city that had once called him divine. He was 30 years old. His hands trembled as they held a dagger to his own throat, but the blade would not go in. He had ordered the deaths of the senators and philosophers, of wives and rivals and friends. He had watched men die in the arena and on the cross. But now, faced with his own ending, he discovered that he lacked the courage to finish what he had begun. Someone else would have to guide his hand. Someone else would have to push the blade home. His name was Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. For 14 years he had ruled the known world. He had stood in marble halls where the voices of petitioners echoed like prayers. He had worn the purple and the laurel crown. He had been called the new Apollo, the bringer of a golden age, the hope of Rome's rebirth. And he had also been called tyrant, matricide, the man who fiddled while Rome burned. Both things were true. Both things were him. And now, as the hoofbeats of pursuing soldiers grew louder on the road outside, as the last moments of his life counted down in heartbeats and ragged breaths, he whispered to himself the words that would be remembered long after everything else was forgotten. What an artist the world is losing! It was a strange thing to say while dying, strange and revealing, and unbearably sad, because it showed that even at the end, even with death reaching for him, Nero could not see himself as others saw him. He could not understand that he was not the victim of this story, but its author. That every choice that had brought him to this moment, kneeling in the dust with a blade at his throat, had been his own. He saw himself as an artist destroyed by an uncomprehending world, a poet martyred for his vision. And perhaps there was a grain of truth in that vision, buried somewhere beneath the delusion and the cruelty. Perhaps. But to understand how Nero came to believe such a thing, to understand how a human soul could become so twisted and so lost, we must go back. We must return to the beginning, to the moment when everything was still possible, when the future had not yet hardened into fate. The city of Antium lay on the western coast of Italy, where the Tyrrhenian Sea crashed against volcanic rocks and the wind carried the smell of salt and pine. It was a resort town, a place where wealthy Romans built their villas to escape the heat and noise of the capital. On the 15th day of December, in the year 37 of the Common Era, in one of those villas overlooking the grey winter sea, a child was born into the most powerful and most dangerous family in the world. His mother, Agrippina the younger, was 22 years old, beautiful and ruthless, a great-granddaughter of the divine Augustus himself. His father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, was a man whose name was spoken with distaste even among the Roman aristocracy, where vice was common and cruelty was ordinary. The child they named Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, after the ancient custom of the Domitii, a family that claimed descent from the earliest days of Rome. The baby was healthy, with a thick shock of auburn hair and blue-grey eyes that would later be called beautiful. But he was born under omens that would have troubled anyone who believed in such things. On the day of his birth, the sun rose through a veil of cloud that turned the morning light, the color of dried blood. In the streets of Rome, astrologers cast his horoscope and found Saturn in the ascendant, a sign of ambition and tragedy intertwined. His father, when told of his son's birth, responded with words that would prove prophetic. "Any child born of Agrippina and myself can only bring disaster to the state and ruin to mankind." It was said half in jest, the dark humor of a man who knew his own nature and his wife's. But the words were recorded and remembered, and when the child grew to manhood and took the purple, people repeated them as proof that some fates are written from birth. Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus was everything Rome's nobility claimed to despise and everything they secretly admired. He was violent without cause, arrogant without justification, corrupt in his business dealings, and sadistic in his pleasures. He had once deliberately run over a child with his chariot on the Appian Way, killing the boy for the crime of moving too slowly. He had gouged out a man's eye in the Forum during an argument over money. He cheated merchants, beat his slaves beyond the point that even Roman masters considered acceptable, and conducted his public duties with such contempt for custom that even the Senate, which tolerated much, found him offensive. Yet he was consul and augur, honored with the traditional offices of the Republic, because his family was ancient and his connections were valuable, and because in the Rome of the early emperors, what mattered wasn't virtue, but proximity to power. His wife, Agrippina, understood this better than anyone. She had been born into power, had breathed its air from her first moment, and she knew that in the imperial family there were only two positions, dominant or dead. Her father had been Germanicus, the golden prince whose charm and military victories had made him beloved by the army and the people, and whose sudden death in Syria had spawned rumors of poison that were never proven, but never forgotten. Her mother was Agrippina the Elder, who had defied the emperor Tiberius and died in exile, starved to death on a barren island, a martyr to republican virtue in an age when such virtue was suicidal. Her brothers had been heirs to the empire, and one of them, Gaius, whom history would call Caligula, had become emperor when Agrippina was still a young woman. She had seen what power could do. She had seen it elevate and destroy, create gods and make corpses. And she had learned the essential lesson. That power was the only protection against power, that safety lay in dominance, and that sentiment was a luxury that could get you killed. When her husband died in the year 40, consumed by dropsy and his own excesses, Agrippina was left with a 3-year-old son and a modest inheritance. Her brother Caligula, who had just begun his reign with such promise, was descending into the paranoid megalomania that would define his rule. He saw threats everywhere, and his sisters, who carried the blood of Augustus, were particularly dangerous. Agrippina found herself accused of conspiracy, convicted on evidence that may or may not have been fabricated, and exiled to the Pontine Islands. Her property was confiscated. Her son was placed in the care of an aunt. And for 2 years she lived on that barren rock, watching the sea and planning her return, knowing that exile was merely intermission, that if she survived, she would have another chance, and that next time she would not make the mistake of depending on the favor of others. In January of the year 41, Caligula was assassinated by officers of his own Praetorian Guard, stabbed to death in a palace corridor while returning from theatrical games. The assassination was chaotic and incomplete. The conspirators had planned to restore the Republic, but had no concrete plan for doing so. In the confusion that followed, the Praetorians found Caligula's uncle, Claudius, hiding behind a curtain in the palace, terrified that he would be next. Instead of killing him, they proclaimed him emperor, seeing in this stammering scholar, with the limp and the tremor, a figurehead they could control. Claudius, 50 years old and overlooked his entire life, suddenly found himself master of the world. One touche. His first acts was to recall his nieces from exile. Agrippina returned to Rome with her young son, ready to begin again. The boy was 7 years old now, old enough to understand that something had changed, but not yet old enough to grasp what it meant. He remembered little of his father, except the smell of wine and the sound of shouting. He remembered the island where he and his mother had waited, the crash of waves against rock, the salt wind that never stopped blowing. And he remembered the journey back to Rome, the way people bowed to his mother now, the way doors opened that had been closed. In the palace, he was housed in rooms that were vast and echoing, decorated with frescoes showing gods and heroes in dramatic poses. He was given tutors who taught him to read Greek and Latin, to recite the old poems, to understand the traditional virtues that Rome claimed to honor: pietas, virtus, gravitas, dignitas, duty, courage, seriousness, worthiness. The words were beautiful, but no one around him seemed to live by them. What he saw instead was maneuvering and flattery, betrayal and survival, and above all his mother's fierce determination that they would not be sent away again, that they would rise, that they would take what had been denied them. Agrippina married again, choosing her husbands with calculation. First there was Gaius Sallustius Passienus Crispus, one of the wealthiest men in Rome, who conveniently died not long after the marriage, leaving his fortune to Agrippina. Then she set her sights on the highest position available. She would become empress. The obstacle was that Claudius was her uncle, and Roman law forbade marriages between such close relatives. The obstacle was also that Claudius was already married to Messalina, a woman whose appetites and intrigues had become legendary even in Rome, where such things were common. But Messalina overreached, apparently marrying another man while Claudius was out of the city, an act so brazen that even the Maetur, emperor's advisers, could not ignore it. She was executed in the palace gardens, and Claudius, bewildered and manipulable as always, swore he would never marry again. Agrippina saw her opening. She cultivated the freedmen who ran Claudius's household, men like Pallas and Narcissus, who wielded enormous informal power. She reminded senators that she was the daughter of Germanicus, the great-granddaughter of Augustus, that her bloodline was purer than that of any other woman in Rome. She positioned herself where Claudius would see her, presenting herself as mature and dignified, nothing like the young bride who had betrayed him. And slowly, methodically, she wore down his resistance. The Senate passed a special decree authorizing marriages between uncles and nieces. Claudius married her in the year 49, and Agrippina entered the palace not as a supplicant or dependent, but as Augusta, Empress of Rome, equal in title to her husband, an honor that had never been granted to a living woman before. Her son was 12 years old. He was renamed Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus, adopted into the imperial family, given precedence over Claudius's own son Britannicus, who was 3 years younger. Nero received the toga of manhood at age 14, earlier than custom permitted, accelerating his path toward power. He was given consular rank, named consul designate, displayed before the Senate as the future of Rome. And through all of this, Agrippina stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder, her voice in his ear, shaping every gesture and word, making sure that everyone understood that this boy was not just another member of the imperial family, but the chosen heir, the one on whom Rome's future depended. What was Nero like in those early years before the weight of the crown crushed whatever innocence he possessed? The sources, written decades after his death by men who hated him, are unreliable on this question. They wanted to paint a portrait of innate evil, of wickedness that showed itself from childhood. But scattered among the propaganda are glimpses of something more complex. He was intelligent, with a quick mind that absorbed languages easily. He spoke Greek fluently and wrote poetry in both Latin and Greek with genuine facility. He was sensitive, moved to tears by music and drama, capable of sitting for hours listening to a skilled lyre player or watching actors rehearse their craft. He was physically beautiful in a way that was unusual for the imperial family, which tended toward either stern martial features or the soft decadence of inherited wealth. His face was delicate, almost feminine, with those striking blue-gray eyes and auburn hair that caught the light. He did not look like a soldier or a statesman. He looked like someone who belonged on a stage. And that was the problem, or at least it became the problem, because Rome valued the military virtues above all others. The city had been built by warriors, expanded by generals, defended by legions. Every emperor was expected to maintain at least the fiction of martial competence, to review troops, to understand strategy, to project the authority that came from command. But Nero had no interest in warfare. He had no taste for the practice field, where young aristocrats learned to throw the javelin and swing the gladius. He found military history boring, strategy incomprehensible. What moved him was beauty, the perfect cadence of a line of verse, the way a singer could modulate between registers, the architecture of a well-designed building, the grace of a tragic actor's gesture. These were not things that Rome's elite valued, or at least not things they admitted to valuing. Art was for Greeks, for conquered peoples who needed to excel at something, since they could not excel at arms. For a Roman, especially for a Roman emperor, such obsessions were dangerous, signs of weakness and effeminacy. But in those early years, when Nero was still learning what it meant to be Caesar, these tendencies could be controlled, channeled, managed. Agrippina brought in the best tutors money could buy. Chief among them was Lucius Annaeus Seneca, the Spanish-born philosopher who had spent the middle years of his life in exile on Corsica, accused of adultery with Claudius's niece, and had returned to Rome only through Agrippina's intervention. Seneca was 53 years old, a man of considerable learning who had written treatises on Stoic philosophy, on anger and clemency and the proper conduct of life. He believed that virtue could be taught, that a rational education could produce a rational ruler, that even an emperor might be shaped into a philosopher king if only the instruction began early enough, and was pursued rigorously enough. Seneca taught Nero rhetoric and philosophy, the arts of argument and persuasion that would allow him to address the Senate with confidence. He assigned readings from the old Greek philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, Zeno and Chrysippus, and discussed with his young student the nature of justice, the proper limits of power, the duties of a ruler to his subjects. He was trying to create a new kind of emperor, one who would govern through wisdom rather than fear, who would consult the Senate rather than commanding it, who would see himself as the first citizen rather than the absolute master. It was an idealistic vision, perhaps even a naive one, but Seneca pursued it with genuine dedication. He saw in Nero a malleable intelligence, a boy who had not yet been corrupted by power, who might still be formed into something better than the paranoid tyrants who had preceded him. But there were warning signs, if anyone had chosen to see them. Nero could not bear criticism. Even gentle corrections would cause him to withdraw into sullen silence or burst into tears. He needed constant reassurance that he was gifted, that his poems were brilliant, that his singing voice was beautiful. When other students in his rhetoric class were praised, Nero would become visibly upset, convinced that the praise directed at others was an implicit criticism of himself. He learned to perform the role of philosopher-student, to give the answers Seneca wanted, but it was always a performance, a mask he wore to please his teacher and his mother. Beneath the mask, his real concerns were elsewhere. He dreamed of standing on a stage before thousands, of hearing the crowd roar his name, not because he was Caesar, but because he had moved them with his art. He imagined himself as the greatest singer Rome had ever known, as a tragic actor whose performances would be remembered for centuries. These were not the ambitions of a future emperor. They were the ambitions of an actor. And in Rome, actors were slaves or freedmen, not citizens, certainly not aristocrats. The disconnect between what Nero wanted and what he was being prepared to become would define his entire reign. In the year 54, when Nero was 16 years old and just beginning to understand the complex machinery of power that would soon be his to control, the Emperor Claudius died. He was 63 years old, and his health had been declining for years, but the suddenness of his death aroused immediate suspicion. The official story was that he had been poisoned by a dish of mushrooms, his favorite food, served at a dinner party. The unofficial story, which everyone in Rome believed, was that Agrippina had arranged it. She had waited 4 years, letting Claudius adopt her son and name him heir, letting the Senate and the people grow accustomed to seeing Nero as the future emperor. Now Britannicus was 13, old enough to pose a threat, old enough that some might argue he should succeed his father instead of his adopted brother. Agrippina could not allow that. The moment had come. And so Claudius died, writhing in agony through the night, while doctors tried unsuccessfully to save him. And by morning the emperor was dead. The palace was in motion. The Praetorian Guard was commanded by Sextus Afranius Burrus, a tough career soldier from Gaul who owed his position to Agrippina. When word of Claudius's death reached the barracks, Burrus assembled his troops and brought them to the palace, where Nero was waiting, dressed in the purple for the first time, a slight, beautiful boy who looked nothing like a soldier, but who carried the magic name of Caesar. The praetorians hailed him as emperor. The Senate, presented with a fait accompli and ringed by armed troops, confirmed the choice without debate. By nightfall, Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus was master of the Roman world. He stood before the Senate the next day and delivered an inaugural address that had been written by Seneca, every word carefully chosen to reassure the aristocracy that the abuses of Claudius's reign would end. Nero promised to respect the Senate's traditional prerogatives, to consult them on major decisions, to restore the division between the emperor's private household and the state's public business that had been eroded under Claudius's rule by freedmen wielding informal power. He spoke of clemency, of justice, of ruling as the first citizen rather than a despot. His voice was clear and pleasant, his manner earnest and sincere. And Rome, exhausted by the paranoia and bloodshed of earlier reigns, allowed itself to hope that this young emperor might be different, that his youth and his education under Seneca might produce something new, a reign of wisdom and moderation. The early years of Nero's rule were later called a golden age, the Quinquennium Neronis, 5 years of good governance that showed what might have been if circumstances had been different. Seneca and Burrus effectively ran the empire, drafting edicts in Nero's name, managing relations with the Senate, ensuring that the vast administrative machinery of Rome functioned smoothly. Taxes were kept reasonable. Justice was administered with relative fairness. The provinces were governed by competent men rather than rapacious opportunists. Public works projects employed thousands and beautified the city. Gladiatorial games and theatrical performances kept the population entertained without descending into the sadistic excess that had characterized Caligula's spectacles. It was, by the standards of imperial Rome, a good government, and Nero was given credit for it, even though his actual involvement in administration was minimal. Because Nero was bored, sitting through Senate meetings, listening to provincial governors report on grain shipments and tax collections, reviewing the endless petitions that flowed to the palace from every corner of the empire. These duties held no interest for him. He would attend because he had to, because Seneca and Burrus and his mother insisted, but his mind was elsewhere. He would sit on the imperial throne, doodling in the margins of documents, sketching stage designs, composing verses, would excuse himself early from meetings, claiming illness or religious duties, and retreat to his private quarters where he could work on his music or rehearse dramatic scenes with the actors he kept in the palace. At night, he began slipping out of the palace in disguise, accompanied by a few companions, to wander through Rome's streets. These nocturnal expeditions were supposed to be secret, but in a city of 1 million people, nothing remained secret for long. Nero and his friends would visit the worst neighborhoods, the dockside taverns and gambling dens where ordinary Romans drank cheap wine and complained about their lives. Sometimes they would start fights, attacking random citizens just for the thrill of it. Sometimes they would break into shops and steal merchandise they didn't need. Once Nero was recognized and beaten badly enough that he returned to the palace with a black eye and split lip, requiring Seneca to concoct a story about an accident during exercise. These Adventures terrified his advisers, who understood that if the emperor were killed during one of these outings, the succession crisis would plunge Rome into civil war. But they couldn't stop him. Already, at 17 years old, Nero was discovering that the one freedom emperors possessed was the freedom to ignore advice. In the palace, the power struggle between Agrippina and Nero's advisers was becoming impossible to ignore. Agrippina had made her son emperor, and she intended to rule through him. She wanted to attend Senate meetings, sitting beside Nero's throne, visible proof that she shared his power. She wanted her face on coins alongside his, equal in prominence. She wanted her opinion to determine policy, her word to carry the weight of imperial command. But Seneca and Burrus understood that if Agrippina were allowed such influence, they would become irrelevant, and more importantly, the Senate would never accept being ruled by a woman, even one with Augustus's blood. So they worked to exclude her, to hold meetings without informing her, to draft edicts that reflected their policies rather than hers. Nero was caught in the middle, pulled between his mother's demands and his advisor's counsel. Agrippina had controlled him his entire life, making every decision, shaping his path to power through her own ambition. He owed her everything: the crown, the palace, the very name Caesar. But he was also beginning to chafe under that control, to resent the constant reminders that he ruled only because she had made it possible, that his authority was borrowed from her will. When she criticized his nighttime adventures or his artistic pursuits, he would respond with sullen silence or sudden anger. When she demanded that he dismiss a mistress or appoint one of her favorites to an office, he would comply, but with visible reluctance. The relationship was fraying, and everyone in the palace could feel the tension building. The mistress was named Acte, a freed woman of Greek origin who had probably been born a slave. She was beautiful and gentle, devoted to Nero in a way that seemed genuine rather than calculated. He spent hours with her, finding in her company a refuge from the demands of imperial life, someone who wanted nothing from him except his presence, who asked no favors and played no political games. For Agrippina, this relationship was intolerable. She had arranged Nero's marriage to Octavia, the daughter of Claudius and sister of Britannicus, precisely to bind him more closely to the imperial family, to reinforce his legitimacy. For Nero to waste his time with a freed woman, to humiliate his wife, and by extension his mother, was a betrayal of everything Agrippina had worked for. She confronted Nero in the palace, calling Acte a slave, calling him a fool, threatening to support Britannicus for the throne if Nero would not behave as an emperor should. It was the wrong thing to threaten. Britannicus was 14 years old now, Claudius's natural son, and though he had accepted his adoption and subordination with apparent grace, his very existence was a standing reminder that the succession might have gone differently. Some of the older senators, who remembered Claudius fondly or who resented Agrippina's machinations, spoke quietly of Britannicus as an alternative, a true Claudian rather than an adopted pretender. If Agrippina threw her support behind Britannicus, if she convinced the Praetorians that Nero was unworthy, then everything could be taken away as quickly as it had been given. Nero understood this, and in understanding it, he made the decision that would mark his transformation from figurehead to tyrant. Britannicus died at a dinner party in the palace. He was sitting near Nero, eating and drinking, when suddenly he was seized by convulsions. His face turned purple, foam appeared at his lips, and within minutes he was dead. Nero remained at the table, continuing to eat, instructing the other guests to do the same. He explained calmly that Britannicus had suffered from epilepsy since childhood, that such seizures were common, that there was nothing unusual about what had happened. The body was removed and burned quickly, without the elaborate funeral rites that a member of the imperial family would normally receive. The explanation was barely plausible, and no one believed it. Britannicus had been poisoned almost certainly at Nero's order, eliminated because his existence had become inconvenient. The death transformed Nero's relationship with his mother. Agrippina had taught him that power required ruthlessness, that family could not be allowed to stand in the way of survival. Now he had applied that lesson to remove an obstacle she had created. She had made him emperor, but she had also made him capable of this. And in demonstrating that capability, Nero had shown that he no longer needed her guidance, that he could make the darkest choices without her hand on his shoulder. From that point forward, Agrippina was not an advisor, but a threat, someone who knew too much and wanted too much and could never be satisfied with anything less than total control. But here we must pause and ask a harder question. Was Nero already lost at this point, or was there still something in him worth saving? He was 17 years old. He had killed his adopted brother. He had lied about it to the Senate and the people. He had watched the boy die and continued eating dinner. These are not the actions of someone with a functioning conscience. And yet he could still be moved to tears by music. He could still write poetry that showed genuine feeling. He could still love Acta with what seemed like authentic tenderness. He could still, in certain moments, show flashes of the clemency that Seneca had tried to teach him. The contradiction is important because it suggests that Nero was not a monster by nature, but a human being whose moral development had been warped by circumstances, by the absolute power he wielded before his character was formed, by the example of a mother who valued survival above all else, by the isolation of imperial life that made everyone around him either a flatterer or a threat. In the years that followed Britannicus's death, Nero settled into a pattern that would define his reign. On the one hand, he was a competent enough emperor when it came to the ordinary business of government. With Seneca and Burrus managing the details, the empire ran smoothly. Provincial governors were held accountable for their conduct. The army remained loyal and effective. Trade flourished. The people had bread and entertainments. Rome was at peace, its borders secure, its administration functional. If Nero had been content to let his advisors govern while he pursued his private interests, his reign might have been remembered as successful despite his personal eccentricities. But Nero was not content. He wanted to be loved, not as an administrator, but as an artist. He built a private theater in the palace where he could perform before invited audiences. He took singing lessons from the finest vocal instructors available, practicing for hours, believing that with proper training he could achieve true mastery. He wrote epic poems about the Trojan War and tragic dramas about Greek heroes. He surrounded himself with artists and performers, people who shared his passion for beauty and who could discuss aesthetics without reminding him of his imperial duties. And gradually he began to perform, not just for private audiences, but for the Roman public. This was where things became dangerous, because for a Roman emperor to appear on stage was to violate one of the deepest taboos of aristocratic culture. Acting was considered a degrading profession, suitable only for slaves and freedmen. For a citizen to perform for money or applause was to make himself a prostitute, selling his dignity for entertainment. And for an emperor to do so was to bring disgrace not just on himself, but on Rome itself, to show the world that the master of civilization was no better than a hired entertainer. The Senate was horrified. The older aristocrats muttered about the degeneration of traditional values. And yet, what could they do? Nero was emperor. He had the army, the Praetorian Guard, the loyalty of the people who enjoyed his performances. To oppose him openly was to risk the charge of treason. So Rome learned to applaud. When Nero announced games called the Juvenalia, ostensibly to celebrate his first beard shaving, but really to provide an occasion for performances, the entire aristocracy was compelled to attend. Senators and their wives were forced to compete in athletic contests and theatrical performances, degrading themselves before the watching crowd. Nero himself sang and played the lyre, performing scenes from tragic dramas, his voice amplified by the mask he wore. And the audience cheered, because to remain silent during the emperor's performance was dangerous, because agents were scattered through the crowd, taking note of who applauded enthusiastically and who did not, because everyone understood that Nero's vanity was boundless and his memory for slights was long. The people, though, genuinely enjoyed the spectacles. Nero spent lavishly on public entertainment, staging elaborate games and theatrical performances, opening his gardens to the public, distributing food and money. He presented himself as a popular emperor, one who cared more about the happiness of ordinary Romans than the approval of stuffy senators. And in some ways, this was true. Nero did feel a connection to the crowd, to the roar of applause that washed over him when he performed. It fed something in him that nothing else could satisfy, some desperate need to be seen and valued for himself rather than his bloodline. The crowd didn't care that he was Caesar. They cared that he entertained them, that he made their lives more interesting, that he descended from his palace to perform before them like a real artist rather than hiding behind the dignity of his office. But popularity with the people is a dangerous foundation for power, because it's fickle and it encourages exactly the wrong instincts in a ruler. Nero began to believe that as long as the people loved him, nothing else mattered. The Senate's disapproval could be ignored, traditional customs could be violated, debts could be left unpaid, and deficits could accumulate, because the people didn't care about fiscal responsibility. They cared about spectacle and entertainment and the generous emperor who provided them. This belief would eventually destroy him, but in the early years of his reign it seemed to work. Rome was peaceful, the treasury was full, thanks to the administrative competence of Seneca and Burrus, and Nero, still in his early 20s, felt that he had found a path forward, a way to be emperor while also being the artist he had always wanted to be. Then came the year 59, and the decision that would haunt Nero for the rest of his life. Agrippina had become intolerable. She criticized everything Nero did, every mistress he took, every hour he spent on music instead of governance. She reminded him constantly that she had made him emperor, that he owed his position to her, that without her he would be nothing. She inserted herself into meetings with foreign ambassadors, tried to attend Senate sessions, demanded that her opinion be given equal weight with the emperor's. She was, in Nero's eyes, trying to rule through him, to be empress in fact, if not in name. And he could not tolerate it any longer. He had already moved her out of the palace, refusing her access to his private quarters. He had stopped consulting her on decisions, but she would not accept her reduced status. She threatened and cajoled, wept and raged, and in her desperation she began to make dark hints about Britannicus, about how Nero's claim to the throne was questionable, about how there were other candidates with purer blood. Whether these threats were serious or just the empty words of a woman fighting for relevance, we cannot know. But Nero took them seriously, and once he had decided that his mother had to die, the only question was how to do it in a way that would not obviously point back to him. The method he chose was elaborate and cruel. He commissioned a special boat, designed to collapse in deep water. He invited Agrippina to a festival at Baiae, a resort on the Bay of Naples, and there he staged an elaborate reconciliation, embracing her, apologizing for their estrangement, treating her with the warmth and respect she had been demanding. After an evening of feasting and apparent harmony, he sent her home on the rigged vessel. The boat collapsed as planned, breaking apart in the dark waters of the bay. But Agrippina survived. She swam to shore, aided by her freedwoman, who was killed in the wreck, and made her way back to her villa. When Nero received word that his mother was alive, he panicked. He summoned Seneca and Burrus in the middle of the night, pacing the floor, wringing his hands. If Agrippina had survived, she would know. She would understand what he had tried to do. She would either expose him publicly or kill him in retaliation. There was no going back now. No way to pretend it had been an accident and seek reconciliation. Seneca and Burrus, confronted with the emperor's confession, understood that they were implicated now, that if Nero fell, they would fall with him. They saw no alternative. Burrus sent a centurion and several soldiers to Agrippina's villa with orders to finish what the boat had failed to accomplish. Agrippina was in her bedroom when they arrived. She had sent word to Nero that she had survived a terrible accident, claiming not to know, or perhaps refusing to acknowledge, what had really happened. When the soldiers entered her room, she understood. According to the accounts, she remained calm. She asked them to tell Nero that they had completed their mission. Then she gestured to her womb and said, "Strike here," pointing to the body that had given birth to the emperor. They did, and when it was finished, when Agrippina lay dead in her blood-soaked bed, they sent word to Nero that his mother had committed suicide after her plot against him had been discovered. No one believed this story either. The Senate presented with a carefully worded letter explaining that Agrippina had conspired against the emperor and taken her own life when exposed, voted to accept it, and thanked the gods for Nero's deliverance. But in private, in the houses of the nobility and the taverns where ordinary Romans gossiped, everyone understood what had happened. Nero had murdered his mother. He had used the most elaborate means to disguise it as an accident, and when that failed, he had sent soldiers to finish the job. And then he had lied about it, forcing the Senate to participate in the fiction, making everyone complicit in the crime. Nero's response to his mother's death was complex and revealing. Publicly, he carried on as if nothing had happened, attending festivals and performances, even making jokes about matricide in the presence of his companions. But privately, he was tormented. He claimed to see his mother's ghost, to hear her weeping in the corridors at night. He consulted with magicians and priests, asking them to perform rituals to appease her spirit. He avoided the Bay of Naples for years, unable to bear the sight of the place where he had tried to kill her. The guilt, if that's what it was, manifested not as remorse or reform, but as paranoia and anxiety. A constant fear that he would be punished for what he had done. And something broke in Nero with Agrippina's death. Some restraint, some last connection to conventional morality, was severed. His mother had been terrible, manipulative, ruthless, willing to destroy anyone who stood between her and power. But she had also been the person who made him, who shaped him, who loved him with a fierce, possessive love, even if that love was twisted and destructive. In killing her, Nero had destroyed the one relationship that was not entirely transactional. The one person who had wanted him to be emperor for his own sake rather than for what they could gain from him. Everything after her death would be emptier, lonelier, more hollow. And Nero, at 21 years old, with absolute power and no one to tell him no, began the slow descent into the abyss. The descent was not immediate. For a few more years, Seneca and Burrus maintained some control, managing the administration and preventing the worst excesses. But their influence was waning. In the year 62, Burrus died, possibly of natural causes, possibly poisoned. The sources disagree. Seneca, now in his 60s and exhausted by the compromises required to serve Nero, requested permission to retire from court. Nero refused at first, claiming he needed his old teacher's guidance. But Seneca withdrew anyway, spending his time writing philosophy, trying to articulate the Stoic principles he had failed to instill in his most important student. The new Praetorian prefect was Gaius Ophonius Tigellinus, a man whose loyalty to Nero was absolute and whose moral compass was non-existent. Tigellinus understood that his position depended entirely on the emperor's favor, and he gave Nero what Seneca and Burrus had tried to deny: permission to indulge every impulse without restraint. Under Tigellinus's influence, Nero divorced Octavia, the dutiful wife he had never loved, on grounds of barrenness. When public sympathy for Octavia threatened to become a problem, she was exiled to an island and then executed on fabricated charges of adultery. Her head was brought back to Rome so that Poppaea Sabina, Nero's mistress who now became his wife, could confirm her rival's death. Poppaea was beautiful, ambitious, and no more interested in Nero's moral development than Tigellinus was. She encouraged his artistic pursuits because they kept him distracted and dependent on her approval. She filled the palace with luxury, bathing in ass's milk to preserve her complexion, commissioning jeweled sandals, spending fortunes on cosmetics and perfumes. The treasury, which had been carefully managed under Seneca and Burrus, began to strain under the weight of imperial extravagance. But Nero found ways to replenish it. Wealthy citizens were accused of the treason on flimsy evidence, their estates confiscated after they were forced to commit suicide. The provinces were squeezed for higher taxes. Ancient treasures were melted down to pay for new building projects. And then, in July of the year 64, Rome burned. It began in the shops around the Circus Maximus in the early hours of the morning, when most of the city was sleeping. The summer had been hot and dry, and the wooden tenements of the poor, packed closely, together in the valleys between Rome's hills, caught fire easily. A strong wind was blowing that night, carrying sparks from roof to roof, and the fire spread faster than anyone could contain it. For 6 days it raged, consuming 10 of Rome's 14 districts, destroying temples that had stood for centuries, reducing entire neighborhoods to ash. The heat was so intense that marble cracked and bronze melted. The smoke could be seen from miles away, a black pillar rising into the sky, visible proof that something unprecedented was happening. Nero was at Antium when the fire began. When word reached him, he rushed back to Rome and threw himself into relief efforts with genuine energy. He opened his gardens to refugees, housing thousands of people who had lost their homes. He organized food distribution from the imperial granaries. He supervised firefighting efforts, sometimes getting close enough to the flames that his guards feared for his safety. He ordered the demolition of buildings to create fire breaks, trying to stop the fire's spread. And when the fire finally burned itself out, he immediately began planning reconstruction, designing a new Rome with wider streets and fire-resistant buildings, funded by his personal treasury. These were the actions of a man who cared about his city, who felt genuine distress at its destruction. But they were not enough to prevent the rumors. Within days, people were whispering that Nero had started the fire himself, that he had wanted to clear space for a new palace, that he had stood on a tower watching Rome burn while singing about the fall of Troy. The story was almost certainly false. Several ancient historians who hated Nero nonetheless admitted that he was not in Rome when the fire started, and that his relief efforts were extensive. But the story spread because it was believable, because it fit the image of Nero that people had constructed, because after the murder of Britannicus and Agrippina and Octavia, after the theatrical performances and the degradation of the Senate, after everything that had marked his reign, it seemed entirely plausible that he would burn Rome for his own amusement. Nero needed to redirect the blame. He chose the Christians, a small and growing sect that had been spreading through Rome's slums, followers of a Jewish prophet named Jesus, who had been crucified in Judea during Tiberius's reign. The Christians were easy targets. They refused to worship the traditional gods, which Romans considered atheistic and offensive to the divine protectors of the state. They spoke of a coming apocalypse when their God would destroy the world and judge all humanity. They met in secret, practiced strange rituals involving symbolic cannibalism, and called each other brother and sister, while sometimes actually living together in mixed-gender communities. To outsiders, they seemed like a dangerous cult, probably plotting against the state, certainly deserving of suspicion. Nero ordered them arrested in large numbers, Some were sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs in the arena. Others were crucified along the roads leading out of Rome. Still others were coated in pitch and set on fire to provide illumination for Nero's evening parties in his gardens. The Christians died singing hymns and praying for their persecutors, and their calm acceptance of torture began to provoke sympathy even among pagans who despised their religion. The historian Tacitus, writing decades later with no love for Christians, admitted that the punishments Nero inflicted seemed excessive, that even though the victims were guilty of hatred of the human race, the cruelty used against them was disturbing and generated pity. This was the first major persecution of Christians by a Roman emperor, and it established a pattern that would repeat for centuries. To Christians, Nero became the Antichrist, the beast whose number was 666, the first and worst of the poor. Emperors who had tried to destroy their faith. In their apocalyptic literature, written in code to evade Roman censors, Nero appeared as a monster rising from the sea, as a king whose reign was marked by fire and bloodshed. And when he died, there would be rumors that he had not really died, that he would return from the east at the head of an army to reclaim his throne, that his resurrection would herald the end times. The Christians, more than any other group, would ensure that Nero's name lived on as a symbol of tyranny and persecution. On the ruins of the burned districts, Nero built the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. It was not a single palace, but an entire complex spreading across more than 300 acres in the heart of Rome, incorporating parts of the Palatine, Esquiline, and Caelian hills. The entrance hall contained a colossal bronze statue of Nero himself, 120 feet tall, depicted as the sun god with a radiant crown. Inside were hundreds of rooms, decorated with gold leaf and precious stones, with ceilings that could rotate to shower guests with flower petals and perfume. There were dining rooms where the walls could be moved to create different configurations, galleries filled with Greek sculptures looted from temples across the empire, baths fed by seawater piped in from Ostia. The grounds included artificial lakes, vineyards, meadows where deer and exotic animals roamed, and a vast colonnade a mile long. The whole complex was designed by architects named Severus and Sylla, who incorporated every luxury and innovation available to Roman engineering. When the palace was complete enough to be inhabited, Nero walked through its empty halls and said, "Good, now I can at last begin to live like a human being." The comment was recorded by historians and repeated throughout Rome, and it was received with bitter irony by the citizens who were still living in temporary housing, who had lost everything in the fire, who watched the emperor's palace rise on land that had once held their homes and shops and temples. The Golden House became a symbol of Nero's disconnection from reality, proof that he valued his own comfort above the needs of his subjects, evidence that he saw himself as a god rather than a man. But the palace was also something else, a monument to Nero's aesthetic vision, a total work of art that tried to bring Greek ideals of beauty to Rome. The rooms were decorated with murals painted by artists like Fabulus, who developed a style that would later be called the Fourth Pompeian style, characterized by elaborate architectural illusions and mythological scenes. The gardens were landscaped to evoke the sacred groves of Greece, places where mortals might encounter gods. The statuary collection included masterpieces from the classical period, works by Phidias and Praxiteles that Nero had acquired through purchase or theft. In creating the Golden House, Nero was trying to build a bridge between the martial pragmatism of Rome and the cultural refinement of Greece, to show that empire could be beautiful as well as powerful. The problem was that Romans didn't want their emperor to be an aesthete. They wanted him to be a general, a lawgiver, a stern father figure who embodied traditional virtues. And Nero, more than ever, was abandoning even the pretense of being that kind of ruler. He announced that he would tour Greece, the land he considered his spiritual home, where his artistic talents would be properly appreciated. Before departing, though, there was one more conspiracy to suppress, one more set of enemies to eliminate. The Pisonian conspiracy, named for its leader Gaius Calpurnius Piso, was the most serious threat Nero had faced. It included senators, knights, praetorian officers, even members of Nero's personal guard. These were not marginal figures, but members of Rome's elite, men who had concluded that Nero's rule had become intolerable and that the only solution was assassination. The plot was extensive and well organized, with plans to kill Nero during public games and proclaim Piso emperor immediately afterward. But one of the conspirators, unable to bear the tension of waiting, confessed to a freedwoman who brought the information to Nero. The purge that followed was swift and brutal. Piso was ordered to commit suicide. Seneca, though his involvement was unclear, was added to the list, possibly because Nero feared his old teacher's reputation, possibly because Nero wanted his wealth, possibly because after years of compromised service, Seneca had become a reminder of ideals that Nero had betrayed. Soldiers came to Seneca's villa and delivered the emperor's order. The old philosopher accepted the sentence with stoic calm. He opened his veins in a warm bath, dictating his final thoughts to a secretary while the blood drained slowly from his body. His wife, Paulina, tried to die with him, cutting her own wrists, but Nero ordered her wounds, bandaged, denying her the dignity of choosing her own death. Also implicated was the poet Lucan, Seneca's nephew, who had once been Nero's friend and literary rival. Lucan had written an epic about the civil war between Caesar and Pompey, a work of genuine talent that had made Nero jealous enough to ban him from further publication. Faced with Nero's order to die, Lucan opened his veins while reciting verses from his own poem about a wounded soldier bleeding to death. He died at 25, his literary promise cut short by an emperor who could not tolerate rivals even in art. The purge expanded in concentric circles. Anyone who had known about the conspiracy and failed to report it was guilty. Anyone who had spoken critically of Nero was suspect. Anyone with wealth or a distinguished name was dangerous. The emperor who had promised clemency in his inaugural address now presided over executions and forced suicides on a scale that rivaled the worst days of Tiberius and Caligula. And Rome learned to live with fear, to speak in careful phrases, to smile at the emperor's performances and applaud his poems, because the alternative was a visit from soldiers carrying orders written in Nero's hand. In the year 66, Nero finally departed for Greece. He traveled with an enormous entourage, thousands of courtiers, servants, musicians, actors, and soldiers. He entered each Greek city as a returning hero, as Apollo incarnate, as the liberator who would restore Greek culture to its proper place in the world. He participated in all 4 major Pan-Hellenic festivals, the Olympic, Pythian, Isthmian, and Nemean Games, competing in chariot racing, singing, tragic acting, and lyre playing. He won every competition he entered. When his chariot overturned during a race and he couldn't finish, he was awarded the crown anyway, on the grounds that his intention to compete demonstrated his excellence. To modern sensibilities, this spectacle seems absurd. A grown man forcing judges to award him victories he hadn't earned, an emperor traveling thousands of miles to collect crowns in competitions rigged in his favor. But to Nero, it was validation. Greece, the birthplace of everything beautiful, had recognized his talent. The judges' votes proved that he was truly an artist, not just an emperor playing at art. He collected 1,800 crowns, and he wore them in processions through Greek cities, hearing crowds cheer his name. That the crowds had no choice but to cheer, that the judges would have been executed for voting against him, that the whole exercise was a transparent charade. These facts did not penetrate his consciousness. He believed. And that belief, that desperate need to be recognized as an artist rather than as merely Caesar, drove him forward even as his empire was beginning to fracture. In Rome, the treasury was empty. Nero's building projects, his extravagant gifts to actors and charioteers, his military campaigns in Britain and Armenia, his tour of Greece, all of it had drained the state's finances. Taxes were raised to levels that provoked resentment and resistance. The estates of wealthy citizens were confiscated on fabricated charges to fill the imperial coffers. Coins were debased, their silver content reduced, causing inflation and economic distress. The people who had once loved Nero for his generosity began to grumble about his waste. The Senate, terrorized into submission by years of purges, nonetheless began to discuss alternatives in whispered conversations. In the provinces, the situation was worse. Judea was in open revolt, requiring legions under Vespasian to suppress the rebellion. The rebellion had begun because of Roman mismanagement and cultural insensitivity, but it had grown into a full-scale war, with Jewish zealots controlling large swaths of territory and Roman forces struggling to reimpose control. In Gaul, a provincial governor named Gaius Julius Vindex raised the standard of revolt, not to make himself emperor, but to call for Nero's removal and the restoration of proper governance. Vindex's motivations may have been genuine. He seems to have been disgusted by Nero's behavior and concerned about the empire's deteriorating finances, but his rebellion gave permission to others to think the unthinkable. That Nero could be removed, that another emperor could be chosen, that the Julio-Claudian dynasty didn't have to continue forever. Vindex's rebellion was crushed by legions from Germany loyal to Nero. But the precedent had been set. In Spain, the elderly senator Servius Sulpicius Galba, governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, declared himself legate of the Senate and the Roman people. He did not immediately claim the title of emperor, but he raised legions and marched toward Rome, and everyone understood what he intended. In Africa, the governor Lucius Clodius Mesa also revolted, cutting off Rome's grain supply from Egypt. And in Rome itself, the Praetorian Guard, unpaid for months and demoralized by the emperor's absence, began to waver in their loyalty. Nero received reports of these rebellions while still in Greece. His first reaction was denial, then confusion, then panic. He considered leading an army to crush the rebels, imagining himself at the head of legions, winning glory through military victory. But he had never commanded troops. He had never studied strategy or tactics. He had never even visited a military camp except during formal inspections. The legions didn't know him as a soldier, and they had no reason to follow him into battle. His other idea was more characteristic. He would go to Gaul personally, unarmed, and weep before the rebel legions, moving them with his sorrow and his artistic performances until they repented and returned to loyalty. This plan was so detached from reality that even his advisors, long accustomed to indulging his fantasies, could not support it. Finally, in December of 67, Nero returned to Rome. He found a city that no longer loved him. The Senate was meeting in closed sessions, discussing how to respond to Galba's advance. The Praetorian Guard was openly negotiating with Galba's agents, discussing the terms under which they would transfer their loyalty. The people, suffering from high taxes and food shortages, were blaming the emperor for their hardships. And Nero, walking through the empty halls of the Domus Aurea, hearing his footsteps echo in the vast spaces, realized that the power he had wielded so carelessly was dissolving like morning mist. He tried to rally support. He appeared before the Praetorians, promising them bonuses and land grants if they remained loyal. He addressed the Senate, speaking of reforms and reconciliation, promising to govern more attentively. He held emergency meetings with his advisors, discussing strategies for suppressing the rebellions. But it was too late. The mechanism of power, which had operated automatically for so long, had stopped responding to his commands. When he ordered troops to march against Galba, the officers delayed, making excuses. When he tried to pay the promised bonuses, the treasury officials informed him there was no money. When he looked for his closest supporters, he found that many had quietly left the city or retired to their estates, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. In June of 68, the crisis came to a head. The Senate met and declared Nero a public enemy, an official condemnation that meant he could be killed on sight with no legal consequences. They proclaimed Galba emperor, investing him with all the powers and dignities of the position. The Praetorian Guard, their loyalty finally purchased, accepted the Senate's decree and prepared to carry out the judgment. Nero woke on the morning of June 9th to find the palace empty. His guards had disappeared during the night. His servants had fled. His advisors were gone. He ran through the corridors calling for help. But there was no answer. He knocked on the doors of companions who had shared his revels and performances, but the rooms were locked and silent. In desperation, Nero considered his options. He could flee to Egypt, where he still had some supporters. He could throw himself on the mercy of the Parthian king, Rome's great enemy in the east. He could make a public appeal to the people, reminding them of his generosity and his love for Rome. He could surrender to the Senate and hope for exile rather than execution. But he couldn't decide. He stood in the palace, paralyzed by fear and disbelief, unable to comprehend that the world had simply stopped obeying him, that the absolute power he had wielded had evaporated overnight. A few freedmen remained, either loyal or too frightened to abandon him completely. One of them, named Phaon, offered his villa outside Rome as a hiding place. It was a modest estate about 4 miles from the city, reachable by quiet roads where they might avoid detection. Nero wrapped himself in a dark cloak and mounted a horse. With only 4 attendants, he rode through the streets of Rome in the grey dawn light. He heard soldiers searching for him, heard his name shouted in anger, heard the Senate's decree being read aloud in the Forum, that Nero Caesar was a traitor and an enemy of the Roman people, that he was sentenced to death by ancient punishment, to be stripped naked, fastened by the neck in a wooden fork, and beaten to death with rods, his body then thrown into the Tiber. The description of the punishment terrified him more than death itself. It was a punishment reserved for the lowest criminals, for slaves and traitors, a death without dignity or honor. Nero, who had spent his entire life performing, who had imagined his death as a tragic scene that would move audiences for generations, could not bear the thought of dying in such a degrading manner. He rode on through the outskirts of Rome, past the gardens and villas of the wealthy, into the countryside beyond. At one point, the small group had to dismount and lead their horses through brambles to avoid a patrol. Nero's cloak caught on thorns, his face was scratched, and when they finally reached Phaon's villa, he was bleeding and exhausted. The villa was small and poorly furnished, nothing like the palaces Nero was accustomed to. He was taken to a slave's quarters, a cramped room at the back of the house, and told to wait there while his companions watched for pursuers. Nero lay on a rough bed, listening to the sounds of soldiers searching the area, hearing horses on the road, voices calling orders. He asked for water and was brought a cup of tepid liquid from a puddle. He asked for food and was given stale bread. He asked for wine and was told there was none. Everything that had defined his life, luxury, obedience, the instant gratification of every whim, was gone. He was just a man hiding from justice, waiting for the inevitable. His companions urged him to die before he was captured. They pointed out that if soldiers took him alive, he would be dragged back to Rome and executed in the Forum as the Senate had decreed, that his death would be public and degrading, that he would lose even the dignity of choosing his own end. They brought him a dagger and encouraged him to use it. Nero held the blade, turning it over in his hands, testing its sharpness against his thumb, but he could not bring himself to push it in. He had ordered death for so many others, had signed execution orders without hesitation, had watched men die in the arena for his entertainment. But faced with his own mortality, he discovered that he was not brave, that all his performances of heroic roles had not prepared him for this moment. He wept and complained. He spoke of how unfair it was, how ungrateful Rome had been, how he had loved his people and given them everything. He recited fragments of poetry, trying to find verses appropriate to the moment, but unable to remember them properly. He kept saying, "What an artist the world is losing," as if his death were primarily a tragedy for art rather than the predictable end of a tyrant's reign. He asked his companions to show him how to die properly, to demonstrate the correct technique for suicide. But they couldn't or wouldn't. Time passed. The sun rose higher. The sounds of soldiers searching grew louder. Finally, a messenger arrived with news that the Senate had confirmed the sentence and that soldiers were approaching the villa. There was no more time. One of Nero's freedmen, perhaps Epaphroditus, took Nero's hand and guided the dagger to his throat. The blade went in awkwardly, more of a tear than a clean cut. Nero fell forward, gasping and bleeding, but not yet dead. A centurion entered the room and found him on the floor, blood spreading across the tiles. The officer tried to staunch the wound with his cloak, claiming afterward that he had come to save the emperor, that he had planned to escort him safely back to Rome. But Nero knew better. He whispered, "Too late. Is this your loyalty?" And then he died. He was 30 years old. He'd ruled for 13 years and 8 months, longer than anyone except Tiberius and Augustus. He died without dignity, without the heroic grace he had imagined, bleeding slowly in a slave's quarters while soldiers stood over him. There were no tragic choruses, no applause, no audience to appreciate the performance. Just death, ordinary and undignified and final. His body was wrapped in a cheap blanket and carried back to Rome. There was no state funeral, no procession through the Forum, no eulogies in the Senate. The Julio-Claudian dynasty had ended, and Rome wanted to forget it as quickly as possible. But 2 women arranged for his cremation, Ecloge and Alexandria, his old nurses, and Actor, the freedwoman he had loved in his youth. They prepared his body according to proper ritual, dressed him in white robes embroidered with gold, and burned him on the family estate of the Domitii, returning him in death to the name he had been given at birth, before the adoption, before the crown, before everything that had made him Nero. His ashes were placed in a tomb on the Pincian Hill in the family mausoleum of the Domitii. The tomb was marked with a simple inscription, and for a time people left flowers there. Not many, but some. There were those who remembered the young emperor who had promised clemency and reform, who had rebuilt Rome after the fire, who had entertained the people with lavish games. There were those who remembered his beauty, his artistic aspirations, the way he had tried to bring Greek culture to Rome, even if his methods were flawed. And there were Christians who, while they hated him for the persecution he had inflicted, nonetheless recognized him as the first emperor to have noticed them at all, to have considered their faith significant enough to be dangerous. But mostly, Rome wanted to forget. The Senate passed a damnatio memoriae condemning Nero's memory. His statues were pulled down, his face chiseled off monuments, his name struck from public inscriptions. The Domus Aurea was stripped of its treasures and filled with rubble, and later emperors built their own monuments on top of it, burying the Golden House beneath the Colosseum and the baths of Trajan. The colossal statue of Nero was reworked into an image of the sun god, its features made generic, its association with the dead emperor erased. Within a generation, Romans spoke of Nero only as an example of tyranny, a cautionary tale about what happened when power was absolute and unchecked. The historians who wrote about him decades later, Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, compiled accounts of his cruelties and his madness, creating a portrait so dark that it's difficult to separate truth from propaganda. They described him as a monster who killed his mother and his wives, who burned Rome for his own amusement, who persecuted Christians for sport, who bankrupted the treasury to build palaces and fund his artistic delusions. And all of these things were true, or mostly true, or true enough that the exaggerations hardly matter. But there is another truth, harder to access because the sources didn't care about it, because nuance was less interesting than condemnation. Nero was also a human being who had been given impossible burdens before his character was formed. He was a child, raised by a mother who saw him as an instrument of her ambition, educated by philosophers who hoped to make him virtuous, but couldn't protect him from the corrupting effects of absolute power. He was placed on a throne at 16, told he was divine, surrounded by people who lied to him because they feared him or wanted something from him. He wanted to be loved for himself, for his art, for his humanity. But everyone he met saw only Caesar, only the power he wielded, only the benefits or dangers of his favor. He was capable of genuine feeling. He loved Acte, the freed woman, with what seems to have been authentic affection. He was moved to tears by music and poetry. He grieved his mother even after murdering her, haunted by what he had done. He felt genuine distress when Rome burned and worked hard to provide relief. These moments of humanity existed alongside the cruelty and the maudiness, and they make his story more tragic rather than less, because they show that he might have been different if circumstances had been different, if power had not isolated him so completely, if he had been allowed to be ordinary. The great tragedy of Nero is not just that he was a tyrant, but that he was a tyrant who desperately wanted to be something else. He wanted to be an artist, to be loved for his performances rather than feared for his power. But emperors cannot be artists, not really, because their audience has no choice but to applaud, because every creative act is also a political act, because the distance between ruler and ruled cannot be bridged by art any more than by law. Nero never understood this. He stood on stages before thousands and heard their applause and believed it was real, believed they loved him for his talent rather than his crown. And that delusion, sustained by fear and fed by vanity, made him capable of anything. Because if the people loved him truly, then anything he did must be justified. In the end, he died alone. That is what absolute power does. It isolates, it creates a distance that cannot be crossed by genuine human connection. Nero had everything: palaces and treasures, legions and provinces, the accumulated glory of Rome at his command. But he had nothing. No friends he could trust, no family that loved him, no achievement he could point to with honest pride. He spent his reign performing, putting on masks and playing roles, and when the performance ended, there was nothing beneath the masks but fear and emptiness. The night after Nero's death, Rome was quiet. The same stars that had watched the city rise from a village on the Tiber to the capital of an empire looked down on streets where soldiers patrolled and citizens whispered behind closed doors. Galba was approaching the city, preparing to take power, and everyone was waiting to see what kind of emperor he would be, whether he would restore the republic that had been dead for a century or simply become another tyrant wearing different robes. The future was uncertain, as it always is in times of transition. But in that uncertainty, there was also possibility. Nero had shown what not to be, had demonstrated with perfect clarity the dangers of absolute power wielded by a soul unprepared to bear it. Future emperors would be measured against him, judged by whether they avoided his excesses. His reign would stand as a warning that blood and divine ancestry meant nothing if character was lacking, that artistic sensitivity could coexist with moral emptiness. that the crowd's applause was no substitute for genuine virtue. That power without restraint destroyed not just the subjects, but the ruler himself. On the Pincian Hill, in the Domitii tomb, Nero's ashes rested in a marble urn. Above the tomb, the night sky turned slowly toward dawn, and in the silence before morning, in the space between one reign and the next, between what had been and what would come, there was only the stillness that follows every ending. No judgment, no commentary, no meaning except what each person brought to it. Just the fact of a life lived and finished, of choices made and consequences accepted, of a young man who had been given the world and lost his soul, who had performed on the greatest stage in history and died alone in a cramped room, forgotten by everyone except the few who had loved him despite everything he had become. The dawn came eventually, as it always does. The sun rose over Rome, illuminating the Forum and the temples, the tenements of the poor and the villas of the rich, the monuments of the past and the ruins of the recent fire. People woke and went about their daily routines, buying bread and gossiping and working and living, because life continues even when emperors fall, because Rome was larger than any single man, because the story goes on even after individual stories end. And somewhere in that continuation, in that remorseless forward movement of time and history, Nero's reign became memory, and memory became lesson, and lesson became the foundation on which later generations would build their understanding of power and its discontents. What an artist the world lost, Nero had said. But perhaps what the world lost wasn't an artist, but simply a human being who had been given too much too soon, who had been broken by the weight of expectations and the emptiness of absolute power, who had lived in a palace of gold and died in a room of clay. And perhaps the real tragedy is not his greatness, cut short, but his humanity destroyed. Not the art, the world, lost, but the person he might have been if the crown had never been placed upon his head. The story of Nero ends here, in the quiet after his death, in the space where judgment hasn't yet hardened into certainty. He was a tyrant and a murderer. He was also a lost soul, damaged from birth, never given the chance to be ordinary. Both things are true, and in that contradiction, in the space between condemnation and understanding, is where his ghost still walks, neither monster nor victim, but something more complicated and more human, a reminder of what we all are capable of becoming when power and need and fear align in a single life.